Welcome to Roleplaying History, the podcast where we explore the history of role-playing games. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'll be your guide for today's tour. Episode 131, TV and Movies Based on Role-Playing Games. Okay, so right off the top, I wanted to address the fact that I numbered this show 131 after numbering last week's show 131. Truth is, last week was 130, which is the number that showed up when you pulled it up on your favorite streaming source. Somewhere along the line when I wrote the script for the show, I got confused on my show numbers and I numbered last week's show incorrectly. And it wasn't until I'd already recorded and edited it and was uploading it that I noticed the problem, so I had to leave it as was. Long story short, I'm the one in charge of quality assurance and I'm the one that effed it up. Moving on to the subject of this week's show. I know when I say TV and movies based on role-playing games, I'm basically talking about D&D. Trust me, I've been scouring the internet for weeks looking for other games that have had television or movies done on them, but other than the variety of live play shows on YouTube, Twitch, and other providers, I've been coming up short. Now, there is an exception to that. And as I am doing this show, it dropped last weekend. And that's the teaser trailer for the Fallout television series that's coming in April of 2024 on Amazon Prime. But the show itself hasn't been out yet, so I can't really talk about it. But the trailer looks cool. If you haven't seen it yet, I'll try to link to it on the YouTube channel. I have already posted it on the Badgm Productions Facebook page, so check it out. Now, that's not to say that there aren't movies and TV out there that have the feel of some role-playing games. I mean, the Cthulhu mythos is everywhere, and there are a lot of movies out there that draw directly from the world of Lovecraft. So in a way, you can say these movies are based on the game, since the Cthulhu games are drawn almost directly from the source materials themselves. However, one can also argue, and correctly, that the games draw from the literature, so the movies are drawing from the literature as much as they are from the game. You know what? Why don't I stop talking in circles? You got the point, and it doesn't make the movies any less cool. Let me see if I've got another example. Looking at it from a gaming perspective, there are some aspects of the movie Underworld that have some Vampire the Masquerade features. Now, just before you at me, I realize there's a lot of differences there, but there are some setting details and cliquish interactions amongst the vampires that give it a feel that's a lot like the game. And let's be honest, there's a whole lot of Kate Beckinsale. I'm just saying. I'm married, not dead. I got a couple of messages last week about Lord of the Rings and or The Hobbit. Now, they've had their own game systems come out over the years, but those who've been listening to this show from the beginning or are old school enough to have already known, you know that D&D itself is based on Lord of the Rings, so that doesn't really count. And judging by the number of memes I've been seeing on my personal Facebook page recently, there are a lot of gamers who agree our groups would never complete that quest properly anyway. So I guess that means we're pretty much left with the 4 movies and 1 television show based on Dungeons & Dragons. Well, I mean, there are supposedly a couple of more series currently in development. We'll get to those later. So why don't we just deep dive into our stack of D&D notes for today's show? And I want to start with what I think is the best D&D adaptation out there, and that's the Dungeons & Dragons animated series, or cartoon if you'd prefer. Now, the first thing we need to note is that the show only ran for 3 seasons, 1983 through 1985, and it only got 27 episodes in total. Now, I realize there are a lot of folks out there, myself included before I did the research, that thought the show ran longer and had more episodes. But there is something that needs to be remembered. 1983 puts us right in the middle of the satanic panic surrounding D&D, and the fact that any network had a big enough set of balls to put a show based on the game on the air says something. Never mind the fact that it was a Saturday morning cartoon. But CBS did have the stones to do it, and Marvel Productions teamed up with D&D Entertainment to produce the show. Toei Animation, I know I screwed that up, a Japanese animation company, handled the visuals for the show, and if you've ever even seen a clip of the show, you cannot argue with the art. And the idea of the show was along the lines of what folks online have joked about wanting to see in various D&D movies over the years. A group of 6 kids, ranging in age from 9 to 15, are transported into the world of D&D by means of a magic roller coaster they get on in an amusement park. Yeah, okay, maybe not the kid thing so much, and okay, maybe not getting transported into the world. You know what? You get the idea. Let's just move on. Once in the world, they meet the Dungeon Master, who, just like in the game itself, is their guide to getting through the world itself. In fact, when they first arrive, he gives each of them a magic item that's supposed to help them along their way. Now, the overall plot of the show is a pretty simple one. The kids need to figure out how to get through all this weirdness they're involved in and find their way back home. Along the way, they take some detours to help others in need, and occasionally they find themselves just straight up in the middle of something without even trying to be. I mentioned that the Dungeon Master is the group's guide through the world, but he's not necessarily the best guide available. I mean, he does give them tips and advice, but he's so cryptic about them that the group basically has to complete whatever scenario they find themselves in on a particular episode for anything that he's said to make sense. Kind of like a real game, if you ask me. And just like in a real game, the group has a variety of bad guys and monsters to deal with, but primary among them is Vinegar, who just happens to be a very powerful wizard looking to take the weapons the kids have to work his plan of ruling the entire realm. Tiamat also makes several appearances, and if you don't know who Tiamat is, to hell with it, let's just do it. Tiamat is one of the 2 most feared dragons in all of D&D and one of the gods of dragons. Well, goddess, if we're going to do the accurate description. She's the evil of the pair, and she's chromatic, which means each of her 5 heads is the color of one of the evil dragons. Black, red, blue, green, and white. And okay, that's evil by the old system. I know they don't do evil anymore, but you get the picture. Okay, back to the show breakdown. Tiamat just happens to be the only creature that Vinegar is afraid of, and that sometimes plays into helping the group rather than threatening them. And I know I'm going to hear it from folks if I don't mention Karina. She's Vinegar's sister and his rival. So again, sometimes her being there winds up being helpful for the group, though some might not necessarily see it that way. Now, when you look at the voice cast for the show, it's a stellar cast of folks, not only from the voice talent community, but also the live acting community. Willie Ames, Don Most, and Adam Rich, who a lot of us Gen Xers will remember from movies and television, each play a member of the group. Ames is Hank the Ranger, Most is Eric the Cavalier, and Rich is Presto the Magician. Peter Cullen played the voice of Vinegar, and if this show doesn't tell you who he is, maybe this will. He voiced Optimus Prime in the 1980s Transformers series. Look, I could go through the entire list, but there's one more I wanted to make sure made this show the one, the only, the legend, Frank Welker. And if I have to tell you who he is, no. Just pull his Wikipedia page, I'm telling you. He's voiced pretty much everyone and everything throughout his career. For this show, he voiced Uni, who is a baby unicorn and another member of the group. He also handled the voice for Tiamat, which isn't a mistake on my point. He voiced a female, and it wasn't the first time he'd ever done it in a cartoon, and certainly wasn't the last. Look, if this was a show where I was covering modules like last week, I'd be breaking down the basics of each story. But with 27 of them, as much as I'd love to fanboy to that level, I promised the movies later on, so I'll move on in the info concerning the show. One thing I wanted to make sure to note is that the show started hot. The first season timed in at 13 episodes, but somewhere along the way, most likely because of the pressure from other groups, the second season checked in at 8, and the third and final season only had 6 in it, though there was supposed to be a 7th. Now, there's a lot of information available about that 7th episode, since the writer for that show, Michael Reeves, has released a lot of info on it over the years. That show would have changed the direction of the show moving forward, as it would have revealed that both Vinegar and Karina were the children of the Dungeon Master, which had been hinted at several times over the course of the show. But that episode never got produced because CBS pulled the plug. However, the episode has gotten a lot of love over the years. Most of that love comes from the fact that Reeves actually published the entire script on his personal website. That led BCI Eclipse, who did the first DVD release of the show, to include that episode as an audio drama on the set. It also saw life as a fan-made animated version. It used animations from the original series, but had a ton of new voices, though Frank Welker came back, along with Katie Lee, who voiced Sheila the Thief in the original. Tell you what, since I brought it up, let's talk about the various home media releases over the years. In 2004, Europe saw the release of the series from Contender Entertainment Group, which was based in the UK. But rather than release it as one entire release, 4 separate standalone DVDs were released, and each disc had a different artwork on the front of it. And as was the case at the time, each disc had DVD-ROM content on it, and they each also had fan commentary and character profiles. For those of us in the United States, we had to wait until 2006 when the first Region 1 release came out. BCI Eclipse LLC handled it through their Ink and Paint animation division. This was a 5-disc set with the complete episodes on it, which is different from the Contender release that edited some of the episodes. It was also digitally remastered, so it looked about as good, if not better, than when it ran in the 1980s. Now, this version is out of print due to BCI Eclipse going out of business in December of 2008. Mill Creek Entertainment picked up the ball and released the entire series again in 2009. It only had 3 discs, but all of the original music for the shows were back, as again, some of that had been edited out over the years for reasons. If you remember the Toon Disney block of shows called Jetix, the show ran during that block from 2006 to 2008, and it got a complete airing on Twitch on July 9th, 2021 as part of the Saturday morning D&D Secret Lair. Now, I happen to have one of those BCI Eclipse box sets somewhere around here, and I can tell you that if you can get your hands on one of them, you should most definitely do so. Oh, and I probably should address why there were so few episodes of the show for one that ran for 3 seasons. I think we can safely take season 3 out, since CBS was in the process of, then finally did, pull the plug. It only ran from September to December, then the slot was used for another cartoon. Season 3, on the other hand, got the I'm about to be canceled treatment because only the first 3 episodes aired in consecutive weeks. Then there was 1 episode each in October, November, and December. So, that's why the show has as few episodes as it did. Now, all of that being said, this show had one hell of a following, and TSR took advantage of that to spin it off into a variety of different products and areas. It got a board game in 1984 when TSR released Quest for the Dungeon Master. It was basically based on the episode In Search of the Dungeon Master, which saw the Dungeon Master being captured by Warduke and frozen in a magic crystal. Vinegar was on the trail of the Dungeon Master, and the goal of the game, as it was in the show, was for the group to get to the Dungeon Master first. And that board game got a Portuguese language version in 1993 from the Brazilian company Grow. Books. Well, of course there were books. There were 6 Pick a Path to Adventure books from TSR. And if 6 sounds like a lot, it's because each book was from the perspective of one of the characters. The UK got 2 hardcover books in 1985 and 1987 from World International Publishing Limited. They contained a combination of prose and original adventures. Our friends in France got a 6-book collection titled Donjons et Dragons, with each book adapting different episodes of the show in storybook form. You want some cards? Wizards of the Coast released a Secret Lair set for Magic the Gathering that was based on the show, and that release came in 2021. For the record, that coincided with the Twitch stream of the series, since it was intended to whet the appetite for the cards. Man, I was going to list out all the comic books, but as I looked at the list, something occurred to me. Basically, if you're a gamer anywhere in the world, chances are you either got the Marvel Comics releases of the game, or a publisher in your region did one of their own. The show's theme got the orchestral treatment, and I mean full orchestra, when Johnny Douglas put it on his 1991 album, The Johnny Douglas Strings on Screen. It's the 6th track on the release, just in case you're a Johnny Douglas fan and happen to have it on hand. If you don't and you want it, check out the Dulcimer Records website. That's DulcimerRecords.com. I believe I did that right. DulcimerRecords.com. You'll correct me if I messed it up, I know. When Ink and Paint did the 2006 DVD release, Wizards of the Coast took advantage of the opportunity to drop in a rule book. Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 Animated Series Handbook was included in the release, and it brought all of the gang up to the current rules and had a new story set before the Dragon's Graveyard, which was episode 20 that aired during the 2nd season. Needless to say, if you didn't get the DVD, you didn't get the handbook, though I'd still check DM's Guild because I wouldn't put it past Wizards of the Coast to put it on there for nostalgia purposes. Now, I haven't checked that, so don't hold me to it. Okay, so I could keep running through the list of other stuff licensed off the show, but let's just say this. If something based on the cartoon could be slapped together by TSR or licensed to somebody else to do the same, it was. Also, I need to remind you that unless I specifically noted it, this stuff's long out of production, so the only chance you've got to find it is probably going to be the dealer room at a convention, or maybe eBay. One more thing that I will add is that eagle-eyed viewers of Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves will note that there were adult versions of the cartoon game room in that movie. If you want to see them, check out the tournament towards the end. They're the ones in the cage in the middle that the heroes get to before they make the decision to get out. We'll talk more about the movie in a little bit, obviously. Now, normally I'd put a couple of reviews here, but instead I decided to hit on both a high point and a low point for the show. And since I tend to like my bad news first, let's do the low point. I mentioned CBS getting pressure from some parent groups about the show, and a lot of it had to do with the level of violence in the show itself. Now look, I'll admit it was a bit much for children's television at the time. And the episode The Dragon's Graveyard was especially concerning, since the characters at one point in the show actually discussed killing Venger. So of course a group came along to complain. In 1985, the National Coalition on Television Violence insisted that the FTC run a warning during the broadcast of each episode that Dungeons & Dragons had been linked to real-life violent deaths. Now, if you listen to the show that we did on controversies, which is available in the archives, by the way, you know that particular fact is complete bullshit. But since we were in the middle of that satanic panic, and since a lot of folks tend to look for a boogeyman when things go wrong instead of the truth, well, you know. But despite all of the hysteria, the show actually let its time slot for 2 years. Now, I guess that could be considered the good news, but there's another piece of good news to share. Tanya Gale Smith, who played Diana on the show, was nominated for Outstanding Young Actress in an Animation Voiceover for the 1984-1985 Youth in Film Awards. And in January of 2009, IGN did a ranking of the best 100 animated series. Dungeons & Dragons came in at 64. And I got to admit, man, I don't want this part of the show to be over. It's been a cool nostalgia trip for me, and since we've got a lot of crap coming up on this show, I'm doing everything I can to avoid getting to it. But I did promise we'd discuss the movies, so let's get to it. And if I'm being honest, there is one good piece on this list. Unfortunately for us, it's the last movie on the list. Then again, you might be fond of one or two of these, and if that's the case, God love you because you're way better than me. After the cancellation of the cartoon series, TSR, then Wizards of the Coast, had been looking to get something on the big screen. Now, I'll get into the history of that momentarily, but the result was the 2000 release Dungeons & Dragons. It was a live-action film with a lot of CGI, and with the actors it had signed up, along with the fervor from gamers looking forward to it, it should have been a success. And I'll be making that comment again later. But it was a box office bomb. It earned $33.8 million on a $45 million budget, and by all metrics you can possibly use, it was an absolute failure. So let's get into the background and the plot of the movie to see just what the hell went wrong with something that should have printed money. In 1990, Courtney Solomon reached out to the folks at TSR. Now, he pretended to be working on an economics project at his school, and he inquired about possible film projects. He was told that studios weren't able to produce a film based on the game because they just didn't seem to get it where the role-playing game factor of D&D was concerned. Solomon kept at it for a year and a half, but finally he was able to convince TSR to start negotiations with him to actually make a movie. And yeah, while Solomon didn't have any experience in the film business, he was a D&D fan. So the theory was he'd be able to tap into the core of what D&D is and get it up on the big screen like it should be. What ultimately sold both him and his idea to TSR was a 30-page proposal that explained what he would do to adapt the game to the screen. Once he'd done that, he had a lot of work to do with TSR to finish the deal. And in a It's So Hollywood deal, it's been reported that the reason TSR ultimately decided to go with him is the fact that his upfront royalty was a better deal for TSR than anything else they'd seen to that point. Of course, it was all about the money. With the deal in place, Solomon had another big task ahead of him. He had to secure financing. He spent another year and a half crossing the globe to find the cash, and he knew going in that a big amount of that budget money he'd get would hinge on the foreign distribution rights. During that trip, he stopped in Asia to raise funds, and he met Alan Zenman, who was a leading businessman in Asia at the time. Now, for whatever reason, Zenman saw Solomon as someone he could do business with, and he and Solomon formed Sweet Pea Entertainment in early 1982 in order to both fund the movie and sell it to other investors. It was at that time that Solomon started thinking about who he wanted to direct the film. At this point in the process, he saw it being a $100 million movie, which was an exceptionally high budget at the time. And with a budget of that size, he was looking at big-time directors. At one time or another, Francis Ford Coppola, James Cameron, Rennie Harlin, and Stan Winston were each attached to the film. Each dropped out for their own reasons, so Solomon was continuing to look for a director as he was selling the movie to investors. At one point, things had gotten so serious that both Movie Line and Premiere, which are both top film magazines, reported on the project. Movie Line supposedly saw the script and said positive things about it, while Premiere revealed details about it, including Winston as the director, a rogue as the lead character, a magical dragon-controlling device, and a huge final battle that would be heavy on effects. This article appeared in 1995, so while it was accurate on some points, we were nowhere near seeing the final product. It should also be noted that at this point, Justin Whalen had already been cast as Ridley, who was the rogue and the lead for the film. That casting was rumored to be one of the reasons Solomon had difficulty finding a studio to release the film or a director to take the chair. It wasn't anything personal against Whalen, he just didn't have a lot of big budget movie experience at the time. One of the other issues impacting the film at this point was a difference of opinion, with Solomon on one side and TSR on the other. TSR wanted a direct-to-video release while Solomon wanted the big screen release. And that's a bigger deal than it sounds like, because the budget for direct-to-video would be considerably smaller than a feature film would be. Now, granted, that's not so much the case today with direct-to-streaming versus big screen, but we're still talking about the 90s here, so just bear with me. Financing was another one of the issues, and those caused Paramount Pictures and Lightstorm Entertainment to say thank you, but no thank you. Now, 1997 brought a Hollywood heavyweight onto the project, and that started to get things moving. Joel Silver, who was at the time still one of the hottest producers in the business, came on board and worked with the writers to get the screenplay finished by June of 97. He had a different vision for that screenplay, as he proposed making a TV series out of it instead of the movie. Since Silver was very influential in the business, Solomon agreed to try to make what he wanted match with Silver's idea. But in the middle of all of this, a bomb got dropped on the project. For those who are familiar with the history of D&D, 1997 was the year TSR sold D&D to Wizards of the Coast. That caused the proposed television series to once again revert to a movie, since that's what Wizards wanted to see at the time, and they pushed it back to the direct-to-video idea that TSR had wanted in the first place. The big reason for that is because the idea of a $100 million budget scared the hell out of them. Plus, the filming deadline that TSR had set when the deal was first made was getting close, so if something wasn't done soon, the whole thing would probably go down the drain. So the budget was set at $3.5 million, and the various improvements in effects technology helped to make that possible. Another huge factor was the decision to film in Prague, since props and sets would cost 5 times less there than they do here in the US. Plus, it doesn't hurt that Prague has some really cool medieval-looking places that they could shoot at with a limited amount of set dressing needed. Solomon decided to take the director's chair for himself, and he shot a 3-minute piece of test footage to show what he could do. Silver, who'd been in the process of walking away from the project due to his own concerns, decided that what he saw was impressive enough that he was going to stay on as an executive producer. That move had a ripple effect, as Silver's name attached to the project caused more funding to come in. So the $3.5 million budget they had originally was now about 10 times that amount at $30 million. That change took the project back to a big screen release and finally settled Wizards' concerns about whether the movie could be real or not. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of the production itself, but I did want to note that Carol Cartwright and Topper Lilland are the credited screenwriters for the project, and Solomon had crafted the story based on 2nd edition AD&D rules. And like I said earlier in the breakdown, the cast was a pretty damn good one. Marlon Wayans was brought in to be the comic relief, Zoe McClellan was part of the adventuring party, Bruce Payne was the bad guy's right hand, and Jeremy Irons played the big bad evil guy. And hell, Richard O'Brien and Tom Baker also had roles in the flick, so the acting alone should have made this a no-doubt hit. I mean, the story itself wasn't the most complicated. You got the Empress of the Land who wants to give the rights in her realm to the common people. She's opposed by the Council of Mages, and since they know she's got a scepter that gives her control over gold dragons, the mages want the Rod of Savril, which would allow them to control red dragons. And the game begins. Our adventuring group gets put together, they try to find the rod, and the right-hand Damodar is constantly chasing after them to get the rod. He ultimately succeeds, gives it to his boss, and the fight between the gold dragons and the red dragons begins. As you'd expect, our rogue manages to kill Damodar and get the rod back. They destroy the rod, and the Empress uses a gold dragon to kill the bad mage. Look, I know there's a hell of a lot more to it, but I think that basically lays it out. And on the surface, that should have worked. I mean, to me, that sounds like a decent adventure for D&D. So where did things go wrong? Now, there are a number of different theories here, but pretty much everyone agrees on at least one or two of these. The characters were written pretty thin and pretty flat. In other words, the actors didn't really have much to do, and what they did have to say frequently came off as either flat or cheesy. I mean, look, I love watching Jeremy Irons chew up scenery in pretty much every movie he's in, but the dialogue here for the most part was so bad that most everybody, and myself included, noted that he had to overact in order to make Profion be the evil mage he was supposed to be. Now, the same can be said for Bruce Payne's Damodar. Interesting concept for a character, but it was obvious Payne wasn't given a whole lot to work with. Marlon Wayans was also a target. Mostly it's because the comic relief he was supposed to be felt forced or inappropriate rather than natural. Some would argue it's Wayans himself, but others do blame the script for it. There was also criticism directed at the effects. Now, while they weren't the worst thing that had ever been seen, even for the time, they weren't necessarily considered to be major motion picture quality. And much like we'll see with the fourth film on our list, the D&D hardliners hated it. I've spoken with more than one gamer about this film over the years, and their faces always seem to look like they sucked on a lemon wedge when they go to answer me. Now, that being said, it did have a pretty damn good opening weekend. It opened at number 5 at the box office and brought in about $7.25 million. It was all downhill from there. Overall, it did about $13.25 million domestically and about $18.5 million internationally, so it got nowhere near making its money back. On Rotten Tomatoes, the average rating is 3.2 out of 10, and only 9% of the critics' reviews are positive. Metacritic gave it a score of 14 out of 100, and CinemaScore gave it a C+. And in 2010, the readers of Empire magazine voted it the 39th worst film of all time. And I'm actually surprised it ranked that low. One final point. While New Line Cinema was the distributor of the film, it's been theorized over the years that they did it because they figured they could grease the wheels for a medieval-type movie since they had one coming out in December of 2000. And I think it did okay since it was Lord of the Rings: Fellowship of the Ring. Now, the failure of a big screen release is typically the end of the line for a potential franchise. But in this case, that didn't happen. Well, I mean, it did, but it didn't really. Let me explain. Warner Home Video agreed to fund a direct-to-video sequel to the movie for a 2005 release. Titled Dungeons & Dragons: Wrath of the Dragon God, it was intended to be a standalone sequel, so that meant the creators weren't tied to the characters or plot line from the original movie. In fact, Bruce Payne is the only actor from the original who appeared in this film, and Damodar is one of the main villains in the film. So, rethinking the mistakes of the first film, expectations were kept low, as was the budget. The film was made for $12 million US, and while it did get a brief theatrical release internationally, it only brought in $1.7 million. In the US, it went straight to DVD and cable, and the Sci-Fi Channel, or what used to be the Sci-Fi Channel, debuted it on October 10th, 2005. Look, I really wanted to do a plot summary for this film, but I got a damn headache just trying to figure it out. I happen to own a copy of the DVD, and I had to shut it off about 10 minutes in. So, you know what? Just look online if you want to know the summary. IGN gave it a 3 out of 10. Monsters and Critics gave it a 2 out of 5. But one thing pretty much everybody agreed on was that Bruce Payne's performance was probably the best thing in the entire movie, which makes sense. He's a damn good actor. Now, I don't know if you can actually find this anywhere unless you already have a copy of the DVD. That being said, check your local pawn shop, used music or DVD shops, or thrift stores for a copy. And that's not me being a smartass. Those are the places I'd be looking for them these days. There was a third movie in this particular line, 2012's Dungeons & Dragons 3, The Book of Vile Darkness. This was a direct-to-video and sci-fi movie with a budget of $12 million, and it utilized the Book of Vile Darkness as its source material. Look, man, I'm sorry. I just can't with this. The first one was bad, the second was worse, and I won't torture myself with this one. I'm sorry, I won't. If you can find it anywhere, check it out, tell me what you think. And I'm sure there are a few of you out there that are going to disagree with me on those second two movies. And I'm perfectly okay with that, since I probably like some stuff you don't. It's just watching these last two gave me a frickin' headache. So, let's move on. The most recent Dungeons & Dragons film, Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, was released on March 31st, 2023 worldwide, and was exceptionally anticipated by the gaming community. Some of that, I'm sure, was the opportunity to get the bad taste of the original movie out of our collective mouths, but I know some of the rest was that when looking at the cast, it was believed that this had to be better than what we saw before. And that was the idea. Hasbro worked with Entertainment One and Paramount Pictures to bring the film to life, and Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daly directed from a script they wrote along with Michael Giello. The story is, again, what I'd call a good campaign story. Fallen Harper's wife is killed. He and his best friend join with a couple of others to engage in crime. Fallen Harper and best friend are captured when a job goes wrong, but they manage to escape prison. The plan is to get the Harper's daughter back, only to find out their former friend and party member has managed to take over the realm through a combination of theft and cunning, and the support of the Red Wizards. From there, they find an artifact they need to accomplish their goal, defeat their former friend, and manage to defeat the Red Wizards before they can perform their foul ritual. And of course, they get the daughter back and all ends well. Look, I know I'm leaving a lot out, but since the film's screening on Paramount Plus, you can check it out for yourself whenever you want. Chris Pine plays the former Harper, who's supposedly a bard. Michelle Rodriguez plays Holga, who's a barbarian and the Harper's best friend. Hugh Grant plays the former party member who sold them out. And Daisy Head is the Red Wizard of Thay they have to defeat. So overall, the cast was, in my opinion anyway, pretty solid. And the sets were pretty cool as well, and there's a reason for that. The prison scenes on the icy land were shot in Iceland, while most of the rest of the movie was shot in Northern Ireland, Belfast specifically. Honor Among Thieves did $208.2 million on a budget of $150 million, and while it was more successful than any of the movies that preceded it, it's been reported that it didn't make what's called its break-even point, which would be the amount of budget plus promotional costs. Then again, I could prove to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that Lord of the Rings lost money, and New Line did try to do that to Peter Jackson for years, so don't think it can't be done. The fans and the critics seem to have liked the movie. Rotten Tomatoes has an average rating of 7.4 out of 10. Metacritic gave it a score of 72 out of 100. CinemaScore, which is an audience-based score, gave it an average grade of A+, and PostTrack gave it a 90% positive review. So what the hell happened with the box office numbers? Part of the issue has to do with the release date and something that happened right before we got to it. The open game license issue with Wizards of the Coast that started late in 2022 and was only resolved a few weeks before the film's release. I know from a lot of the message boards and X threads from the time that there were a lot of people who decided to boycott the film because of the OGL issue. There was also some backlash from what I would call the rules lawyers out there, or at least a few of them, based on just the trailer. If I had $1 for every time I saw or heard someone say, "That's such bullshit, a druid can't wild shape into an owlbear," I'd be able to retire. And I think that a lot of the negativity spilled over, since folks who aren't gamers but were interested in maybe seeing the movie saw what the gamers were saying about it and stayed away. Now, I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. Though I do have to note that I had to say something to my future son-in-law when we went to see the movie. He's not a D&D player yet, but when he saw Chris Pine, he leaned over and said, "I really want to play D&D and I want to be a bard." And I leaned in, my response was, "We can do that, but dude, he's not really playing a bard." And maybe that's what got some people pissed, but I'll say this. The rule of cool was utilized a lot in this movie, and I ain't mad at it. Others are, and that's their right, but I will stand by this being a damn good movie. And we're apparently not done yet. There are 2 projects in the work. Rawson Marshall Thurber is acting as the executive producer and showrunner for a television program for Paramount Plus, and Joe Magnello is working on a show for Amazon Prime. And if he's working on it, you know it's going to be good. And the rumor has started about a possible sequel to Honor Among Thieves. While nobody will confirm or deny anything, Chris Pine was recently quoted as saying he's heard the rumors, and while nobody has contacted him officially, he wasn't opposed to doing it again. So it looks like we're going to keep having new D&D shows and movies coming for the foreseeable future. And with that, we've come to the end of today's show. Next week is our holiday game show. We'll be discussing modules or scenarios that are holiday specific. And I'm going to do my damnedest to try to cover as many holidays as I can. But I got to tell you, some of them are really hard to find stuff for. But I'm still working. In the meantime, check out Bad GM's campaign build-along. This week, we're getting our group into the headquarters of Garson Tactical again. Hopefully, they'll finally be done with them. Bad GM's campaign build-along is available wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, badgmproductions.net. The music we use for this show comes from pixabay.com. Check them out for all your license-free, royalty-free music needs. Roleplaying History is a production of Bad GM Productions. We've got a presence all over social media, so check out the info box for this episode or the website to see where you can follow us. Next week, we get into the holiday spirit, so you won't want to miss it as we ho our way along. That's next week. Until then, I'm Wayne Davis, and you're Role-Playing History.